Okay, I hope it's recording. Can anyone tell me? Yes, there we go. Okay, awesome. So I'm not going to go through everything specifically. You got intensely. You guys can, just read through it. So the University of Pretoria's honours application have opened. They opened the 1st of April 2022. We have a session, I believe it's next week, Tuesday, that will be going through the whole honours application. So if you are interested to know a little bit more, please, you are more than welcome to join that. So weighted average of 70% across all three. So first, second, and third year psychology. Then also, so that their percentage counts, your mark for that counts, but you do need to take RES 320. And yeah, those are just the modules offered. Please give me a sec. Okay, then we have WITS, University of Witwatersrand, and that is the 1st of June. And then we just have the entry requirements and the modules offered. We have UJ, University of Johannesburg, 1st of July. Once again, just the entry requirements and the modules offered. UCT, University of Cape Town, 1st of April, so they have already opened. That's very exciting. These are just a few financing options that you guys could look into. I unfortunately can't tell you too much about it. But yeah, welcome. So I assume that Dr. Labuschagne is just going to go through forensic psychology. So this is just, a brief overview of it, but I'm sure he will be going into depth. This is just the salary per month for a forensic psychologist. So I promise you, it's not 2,500 Rand. It's between 25,000 and 30,000 Rand per month, and about 40 hours per week. And with your qualification in forensic psychology, these are the career paths that you could go into. So these are the universities that offer forensic psychology. And I just want to say welcome to Dr. Gerard Labuschagne. There is just a little bit. Doctor, you are more than welcome to tell us about your qualifications in person. But yeah, that's just that. So if I can hand over to you. Thank you.
All right, so let me just get my stuff going. Okay, I hope you can all hear me and see me. I'm going to just share my screen. I haven't done this on Teams before, so screen, let me see if this is going to work. Are you seeing my PowerPoint slide at the moment or not?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
That's a success. All right. So thanks, everybody. Yeah, so I'm going to be kind of going through the general issues of what is forensic psychology. It's sometimes a difficult thing to actually define, specifically in the South African context. And then I'll kind of, after I've done that sort of general talk, I will then speak about kind of like what I've done in my career in this sort of field, to give you an idea of the types of things that one can do, although I don't think everybody will necessarily go into it in the same way I did, depending what your interests are. Right, so let's jump into this. I just finished these slides today, so I hope they make some kind of sense to you and to me, obviously, trying to present it. All righty. Yeah, just on my own background, I qualified as a clinical psychologist at Tuckies in 1998. That's at the end of my internship. My internship was in 1997. I did that at the military hospital. And then I registered at the Health Professions Council in I think, January of 1998 as a psychologist. I later then sort of and a couple of years after that, I finished my master's in criminology. In between that, I did my PhD about 2 years after I finished qualifying. And then I really worked at West-Corpus Hospital for, sort of the 3 years after I qualified initially. And that was really a very good experience after having done my internship at One Mill. A couple of years after that, when I was working already at the police, I did my LLB, and then I got admitted as an advocate of the High Court. I've never practiced law, but I just got admitted. And during that time in the police, again, I had the opportunity to do lots of different things. I was trained as a homicide investigator by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. SAPS trained me as a hostage negotiator. A couple of years ago, I got certified as a threat manager at the U.S. Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. I'll be going into what that means a little bit later in the presentation. The past couple of years, I've been an honorary associate professor at WITS at the Department of Forensic Medicine, where I give some lectures on forensic psychology to their honors group. They have an honors qualification in forensic sciences, which is open to a wide range of people with some with a psychology background, some with a BSc background, and you can go into an honors there where they basically expose you to the various different types of forensic science fields. 2019, we started the African Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, which is a body that looks at helping develop the field of threat assessment. So I'm the head of that. As I said, I worked at West-Corpus before the police, and I was in the police basically from 2001 until the beginning of 2016, where I was the head of the investigative psychology section, which is essentially the South African police's equivalent of the FBI's behavioral analysis units. So it's essentially focusing on profiling, but I'll get in a bit more detail what that means in a moment. So the big question is, as I said, what is forensic psychology? So you may or may not know that the Health Professions Council only recognizes the following categories of psychology in South Africa as registration categories. So clinical counseling, educational, industrial research, and more recently, neuropsych. So you can't call yourself any other kind of psychologist. You have to register as one of those, and then you have to put that on your letterheads, etc. You can't add the word forensic clinical psychologist. For example, you have to only refer to yourself as what you are in terms of the ethical guidelines. So a couple of years ago, they did try to create the category of forensic psychology, but it was really, I don't think they really knew what they wanted it to be. And as we get into the next few slides, you'll perhaps see why. So the reason why you can only call yourself one of these is otherwise people would just make up lots of fancy titles for themselves. So, you might get people suddenly in the military calling themselves operational military secret psychologists or paranormal psychologists, etc. So we can't obviously have that situation. So technically in South Africa, you can't, if you're working with children exclusively, you can't call yourself a child psychologist. If you exclusively work with sportsmen and women, helping them out, you can't call yourself a sports psychologist. There are people that do call themselves funny little titles, but technically it's actually not allowed in terms of the council's regulations. So obviously, just to also touch on this issue, so when can you call yourself a psychologist? Well, basically, the simple rule is if you are not registered as one with the Health Professions Council, you cannot call yourself one. So in other words, it's actually a title that's protected by law. So unless you are currently registered as a psychologist, you may not refer to that yourself as a psychologist. So it doesn't matter what other qualifications you have. So even if you were registered and maybe you forgot to pay your annual fees that you have to pay every year and you got deregistered, you still wouldn't be able to call yourself as a psychologist. So you have to be actively registered as such with the council. It's actually against the law if you are practicing and any psychological services and you're not registered as such. It's a criminal offense. So like I said, the HPCSA wanted to create forensic psychology as an additional category of registration, and that was first announced earlier, many years ago. I was still working in the police at the time, but the definition was very vague, and I don't think they quite knew exactly what they wanted it to be that made it different from any of the other types of categories of registration that, for example, would anyway allow you to testify in court and give an expert opinion. Just of interest, that scope of practice itself was later withdrawn anyway, so that's not active. So I kind of look at it that you get, forensic psychology, when people talk about it, let me just jump back a slide here. they often automatically think about something like profiling or, working on investigations. But that's really, if you think of it in reality, like 0.1% of psychologists who are doing forensic work actually are doing that kind of work in this country and in other countries. So it's actually, if you define it broadly, it's anything that relates to the criminal justice system. So, if you could be doing court stuff, for example, in criminal cases, you could be testifying whether someone's capable of standing trial for a crime they've committed. You can testify whether someone is criminally responsible for what they were doing during the crime. In other words, was a person reacting to voices that told them to stab the victim, or, did that influence their crime in any way? You might get called to testify when someone has to be sentenced after they've been found guilty of a crime, to advise the court on what risk someone poses. And other times where you might just be required to give expert evidence in a particular criminal case because it was required. Then you get civil cases on the other hand, which is not, criminal cases, it's always state versus so-and-so. State versus Oscar Pistorius, because the state is one of the parties in that particular case. But in civil matters, it's between usually two people. So it's Smith versus Van Sale, for example. And that's a private matter, but the courts are there to help preside over that issue. And that, again, could be anything from, divorce cases, custody issues, someone who needs to be medically boarded from their employment, third-party claims. If someone's been in a vehicle accident and there's been some neurological damage, you often find neuropsychologists are doing assessments and testifying, or whatever that particular case required of a civil nature. And then, of course, in the other side of the sort of justice system could be investigation-related activities. So like what I used to do in the police, profiling, or, we used to have psychologists advising during hostage negotiations and kidnappings, interviewing of certain types of suspects, etc. So that's kind of the justice system is one aspect of forensic psychology that perhaps a lot more people are familiar with. But you also look at it in other types of scenarios. So let's say, you have a doctor who's charged at the Health Professions Council for having behaved in an inappropriate way during his practice. I had once had a case where a guy was accused of kissing a patient, and now she laid a complaint, and now they needed expert witnesses to testify around this issue. Or at a disciplinary hearing at a guy's employment place, or maybe at the university, you're in trouble for something and there's a hearing, and a psychologist, for example, might be involved in some way testifying. Or in a workplace environment, where there's an ethics violation, such as sexual harassment. You might have a hearing there, and again, psychologists might be testifying for some other purpose in that type of case. Or incapacity inquiries related to someone's stress. Should we medically board someone because they have post-traumatic stress disorder and cannot function in the workplace, etc. So that's another actual application of something that you could regard as forensic psychology. So forensic is really the context under which you are actually applying this knowledge. Or it can be, for example, in the treatment. So in the correctional services environment, you get a lot of psychologists who work there, working with offenders, helping rehabilitate them. Or people who are just referred by the courts, they're not in prison necessarily, but the court has ordered that they undergo, therapy for, a period of time to help them deal with an anger issue or whatever the case may be. That is also a forensic capacity in which you are acting. Or the victims of crime. Someone is being, assaulted and goes to the police station. The police have counselors that work with these people, trying to help them get over the psychological aspects of the crime they experience. That would also be actually sort of forensic psychology. And then, of course, can be research-wise, as I did my master's and my doctorate interviewing serial murderers. So that was obviously a forensic topic. So studying victims of crime, perpetrators of crime, or some aspects about criminal behavior regarding the commission of the crime. Again, in that way, you were actually practicing forensic psychology. So you might not in a regular day-to-day basis be doing forensic psych work. You might have a private practice. You might do other stuff. You might lecture at the university. But when you're doing research, you're doing sort of forensic psychology research. So it's not as if it's a permanent title that you carry around with you, that you're always doing, forensic psychological work. And in fact, most of the psychologists I come across do forensic work almost as a small portion of their general practice, where they're doing therapy with people in a non-forensic capacity. Here and there, like myself and others, you could say, perhaps more full-time doing, whether it's custody stuff or the type of work that I'm doing, etc. So I always say it's not in the courtroom. It's what makes it forensic isn't your registration category. It's what the question is that the court needs to be answered. And if that question is best answered by an educational psychologist, then that person is the most appropriate person to be testifying. So in a courtroom scenario, there was a case many years ago where a family wanted to send their child to school a year before the normal age because they felt their child was very gifted, and the education department wouldn't let them register their child a year prior in age. So there was a court case where they obviously went to go to court to say, but our child is very gifted, et cetera, and needs to be, admitted to school already. And obviously in that context, this very much so an educational psychologist was the right person to testify. So again, and that educational psychologist might never have thought of themselves as doing forensic work, but they were the people who perhaps in that scenario were the best one to answer the question. A little bit different, to phrase it differently, I once had a murder trial where one of the questions became the type of pollen that was on the offender's pants. And this is the same kind of pollen found on the types of trees or plants near where the victim's body was found. So they actually called someone from Stellenbosch University who was a botanist and said, but this plant is your, sort of area of expertise. Can you come and testify in court about this type of pollen and how it works? Is it airborne? Is it contact-based, etc.? So that botanist, I can guarantee you, never ever thought of themselves as a forensic botanist, but on that particular day, they're there as an expert witness and behaving in a forensic botany capacity. And that might be the only time in her life that she's ever done anything to do with the criminal justice system. So also when it comes to the sort of the expert witness side of it, there are lots of other terms that people use to describe this work as opposed to forensic psychology. They might talk about medical legal assessments, psycho-legal assessments, or psycho-legal activities or expert witness activities. Again, there's just lots of different types of terms that often pretty much mean the same thing when it comes to appearing in the courtroom. So I would say that the majority of psychologists in South Africa that are practicing some kind of forensic psychology would be in terms of family law, like I said, parenting plans, assisting with custody issues during divorce cases is probably one of the biggest areas of forensic psych application in South Africa. And then you get a very small bunch of people who do some kind of evidence in courtrooms for, as I said, civil or criminal matters. I'd probably say the second biggest area would be third-party claims. People testifying about neuropsychological damage and injury after a vehicle accident is probably the second biggest area. And then, as I said, a tiny bit way down the path after that, the third biggest area might be people who are testifying in some capacity in the criminal courts. Like I said, in terms of the type of stuff that I used to do at the police, I mean, for many years, I was the only psychologist in the police doing this kind of work, and then kind of 6, 7, 8 years down the line, 2 more people joined me in the unit. And at one point, the largest capacity we had of psychologists doing the kind of work we were doing was, I think, 4 or 5 in total. Then all of us left, and then now they've had 1 or 2 more. So a very, very small amount of people actually do what people often think forensic psychology is, which relates to the investigation side of things. So that perhaps logically leads into this whole issue of what did I used to do in the police? And as I said, it was, perhaps you can use the term offender profiling, that often amongst the profession has a bit of a, not hysterical, a bit of a dramatic title. And often people prefer the term criminal investigative analysis as another, as I said, synonym that people use to describe this kind of work. So I worked as I said, at the investigative psychology section, which was started in about 1996. So some of you might have heard of Mickey Pistorius. She was the kind of first person that got profiling going in the police in about 94. The unit was officially established in 96, and then she resigned in 2000, and then I got there a year later. But the unit was never ever part of the psychological services of the police. The unit was established as part of the detective service because it was there primarily to assist with investigations, hence the name investigative psychology. But it is a national unit that then provides, or still provides, its services throughout the whole of the South African police. Although even while I was still there, we started to open up little branches in the different provinces in South Africa, either with detectives or with psychologists, but they were investigative psychology unit people. So within the police, like I said, we originally started off in the detective service, and then with the sort of restructuring and changes in the police, we eventually, and still today, ended up under the Forensic Services Division. And for those of you that don't know, that's kind of got 2 parts to it. On the one side is the forensic laboratories, There's one big one in Pretoria, and then in Cape Town is a beautiful forensic laboratory in Plattekloof. And those are really the laboratories where exhibits are sent, like DNA for analysis, ballistics, drug analysis, other forms of scientific analysis. And those are typically done at the forensic laboratories. And the other part of the forensic services division would be the criminal records and crime scene management. And essentially, that's the sort of CSI component of the police, the people that would go out to the crime scenes, gather evidence, bag it, send it off to the laboratories, or they themselves might do, for example, fingerprint analysis at their own little laboratories. And within that, we were then placed underneath them, along with, you had, for example, your bomb disposal units was also in this criminal records section. The identikits people were also there. So there are a few other sort of ragtag units that they didn't quite know where to place. So we kind of ended up underneath that sort of same leg in criminal records and crime scene management. And our main purpose was to assist with what we call psychologically motivated crimes. Now, as psychology students, you could say, but isn't psychology involved in everything, every decision we make? And yes, I think on that level, you could say yes, whether you like chocolate ice cream or not, whether you like to date these types of people or those types of people, that's all influenced by your individual psychology. But what we're talking about in the sort of criminal way is that, it's any crime that doesn't have an external benefit for the suspect. So I think most of us are familiar with the majority of the crimes that police deal with, which would be something like a robbery, a burglary, a theft, fraud, cash and transit robberies, etc. Where the motive there is financial gain. That person's going to that house to steal items of value. They're robbing a bank because they want the money, which is valuable. And the crime is just sort of like the middle stepping stone. And then the money and what you're going to do with it afterwards is where your real reward is. But with the psychologically motivated crimes, it's kind of as if the actual crime itself is where you get your satisfaction or your reward. So, for example, it includes things like serial murder, serial spree murder, mass murder, which was, again, the unit's reason for establishment was actually because of a spike in serial murders around 1994. So I think in my time in the police, I worked on over 110 different murder series in the 14 and a half years that I was there. I think the most recent one that you might have heard of would be that police member Rosemary Ndlovu from Tembisa, who killed a number of her family members and claimed the insurance money. That is one example of a serial murderer. Otherwise, people like Moses Satolev many years ago are still serial murderers that are spoken about quite often. I've actually got a podcast series called Profiler. I think it's on Apple Podcasts and other platforms, where we talk about a lot of these cases if you're interested. Then, of course, serial rape, infant rapes, pedophiles, stalkers, your multi-murderers, your once-off rape murders, your murders that have very unusual circumstances, your family murders, intimate partner murders like your Oscar Pistorius case, domestic violence, although we didn't typically get really involved in domestic violence because there's too many of those cases, and terrorism, which is motivated by your ideology. So, of course, when we say psychologically motivated, it doesn't mean that the suspect necessarily, in fact, it's very rarely do they have any kind of mental illness, but it's just that their psychology and the psychological benefit of the crime is the reason why they go and commit that particular crime. So the unit or the section has three interlinked roles, which I'll jump into in a moment: supporting investigators, research, and then training. So what's interesting to note, though, is that, a lot of people, if you watch TV and movies, you think that most police services throughout the world have a unit like this within the police. And the reality is it's actually quite rare. The FBI has the behavioral analysis units, which is based in just outside of Quantico. It's not in Quantico anymore. That provides their services throughout the whole of the US. Here and there are a handful of law enforcement agencies in the US that actually have full-time profilers. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, which is a statewide police, they have, I think, North and South Carolina have, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department had, and then he retired. Canada, the Ontario Provincial Police have a brilliant profiling unit. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police also have. So even in Europe, you get maybe 2 or 3 law enforcement agencies. Germany, it's the Bavarian Police, have a very good unit. And the British, not even in the police actually, but the British have this SCAS unit, which is actually part of Home Affairs, not the police. So it's not as common as one actually thinks. So I think the fact that SAPS has had that since '96 on a full-time unit capacity is actually sort of very forward-thinking. Also, the difference is that all of us in the unit were employed as police members. You know, we were employed in terms of the Police Act. We had uniforms, of course, being in the sort of forensics division, you didn't really wear them very often, but we had ranks, we underwent police training, whereas, for example, my colleagues who are profilers for the Dutch police are actually employed as civilians. Like I said, the British profilers are actually civilians. So it's also quite interesting that our members were serving members of the police. Either you joined when you got employed into the unit, or they were people from the police that were brought over. And our kind of policy or motto is from crime scene to courtroom. So, you know, very often we would go out to a crime scene, get involved in the case throughout, or we'd go out to the crime scene and just give our input, and that was enough. Or sometimes we get a phone call from a prosecutor and says, I've just convicted this guy. We need you to come and testify at sentencing about what kind of a danger this person might pose to society. So anything in between those 2 points is where we could get involved, and we stayed involved as long as we felt it was necessary. So just a myths and reality. The purpose of profilers throughout the world is not to take over the detective's case. We weren't supposed to be what we call a docket carrying unit because we were nationally based. So we couldn't be, for example, responsible for an investigation in Cape Town. And then we've also got one in Springbok, and then we've got one in Free State, and we've got one in, Thohoyandou. So we typically were there as an expert investigation service provider or knowledge provider, if you want to put it that way. We'd bring our knowledge about these really strange cases that a detective might never have had any involvement in before, and we bring our experience of having worked on 2, 3, 20, or 100 of these similar kinds of cases. There were some really unusual circumstances where we did actually end up taking over the case. So the Quarry murder series here in Centurion, just off the Samrand off-ramp between Midrand and Pretoria, we had a murder series there in 2006 that it just turned out that I was appointed as the head of the task team to investigate that. There were 1 or 2 cases, such as a stalker case, that I ended up basically doing the investigation, but it was something that we were not supposed to be doing. It was just a sort of a perfect storm, if you can call it that, that led to certain situations where we actually kind of almost took over the case. Other cases, we were perhaps very instrumental in giving advice and suggestions, but there was still a detective in that area who had actually responsibility of that case file. Also, I haven't really touched on, I think I might not have included that slide, is that in the unit we had, as I said, some psychologists, and then we had a lot of detectives. We found that, in reality, profiling is typically throughout the world not done by psychologists, definitely not in the law enforcement context. It's actually 99% of the time, it's detectives who have been trained in profiling. So it was quite unique in South Africa that for myself, I was actually a psychologist who then was trained as a profiler, just to point that out. So we actually have more detectives in our unit than actually psychologists providing various types of input. So in terms of profiling, there's a couple of things we typically would do. Yes, perhaps what you see most in movies is doing the profile of the unknown offender who committed a very brutal crime. So yes, we would do that when it was necessary. Who do we think is the kind of person to commit this crime? What might be their next steps? What kind of person should you be looking for? What would be their motive for their crimes? How would we interview such a person? What could we expect in the background of such a person, etc.? But we also did a lot of what we call linkage analysis. So we have similarities amongst cases, maybe during the investigation phase or even at trial, but we don't always have forensic evidence linking the suspect to all of them. So we would give an opinion based on the modus operandi and other factors that this is the work of the same individual. Sometimes we would be called into a case where they're not even sure, is it actually a murder or is it an accidental death or a suicide? And we would assist in what we call an equivocal death analysis. And sometimes we would do a crime scene assessment where we're really just looking at this really set of bizarre circumstances and just trying to explain why we think certain things are appearing on a particular crime scene. We would often help devise interview strategies for suspects or sometimes assist with the actual interview. Sometimes we would do geographical profiling, which is basically looking at the previous crime scene locations as a mechanism of trying to sort of determine where the offender might strike. next, or where that person might live. And then increasingly, we started to get more and more involved in threat assessments. In other words, someone somewhere, could be, for example, in a workplace, has received a death threat or is behaving strangely. And how do we assess how worried we should be about this? That's the first part of it. And then secondly, how do we mitigate it that worry, that concern doesn't actually take place? And that's what we call threat assessment. And you might do that in domestic violence situations. You might do that in stalking situations. Like I said, you might do it in sort of death threat scenarios, etc. And that's something we increasingly started to do, and also increasingly doing that in the context of terrorism cases. Then we did a lot of, well, not as much as I would have liked, research. And this is also an aspect we added to the unit as it expanded after I left, is that we wanted to have a full-time research capacity. We had all this amazing case file information that really wasn't being used for anything but the case. And we wanted to be able to study all this information to improve our ability to do our work and testify in court. And over the years, we've collaborated either with students doing research or with other universities to produce research on these sort of South African crimes. So we developed a research capacity, and besides the researchers, the detectives and psychologists, we actually started to employ criminologists in the unit. So there's quite a wide spectrum of different types of people actually now that work in the unit. So jumping back to the research, the main aim of the research was to help us better understand these crimes, because a lot of the research and experience out there, specifically many years ago, was American-based. And we learned very quickly that a lot of this stuff wasn't applicable to us, and we had to adapt and learn. And the best way to do that effectively is by actually, doing research on what you've got in front of you. So just some of these people, I don't know if you can see my cursor, various in the middle here, that looks like an ID photo. That's Moses Sithole, perhaps the most well-known serial murderer. I think he was convicted of 36 murders, rapes and murders in the mid-90s. Below him is Kobus Geldenhuys. He was a policeman who was a serial murderer, killing people around the barracks where he was based in Norwood. The bottom left is Thabo Bester, the so-called back then Facebook rapist. He actually committed suicide in prison about a week ago. To the right, this guy with the blue windbreaker on, that's Jaco Steyn. He was the so-called Sunday rapist. He was targeting schoolgirls, raping them, and then eventually, I think the 12th victim he murdered. On the right-hand side of the screen, that's actually the same guy, the black and white picture, and the guy in the green prison clothes. That's John Frank Brown. So he, along with you'll see on the left-hand side, sorry, there's a picture of what looks like a woman. That's actually his male partner. They were a male couple, and they were killing people. Who else that you might or might not know? The top right-hand side is Mlungisi Mchali, who was the Hillbrow birthday rapist. He'd tell everybody it's his birthday, come celebrate, and he would then lure one of the ladies back to a hotel room where he would rape them and sort of leave them the next day. And he was a serial rapist. So these are some of the guys that we were sort of studying and having a look at. Then another, as I said, the third thing we did, which I think sometimes maybe is the most important thing, is training. We would give training to obviously detectives on how to investigate serial murderers and these other types of strange criminals. We would typically once or twice a year present a 3-week training course to detectives. We gave training to prosecutors on how to cross-examine psychologists and other mental health experts. We would give training to them in, what are pedophiles, so they understand the types of criminals that they are prosecuting better. And we would give training to a wide range of members in the police, maybe short one-day training here and there, to try and spread this knowledge around to the various people in the South African police, that they could at least be better at identifying the types of crimes that we get involved in, but also then better at investigating them, better at processing the crime scenes, etc. So that was definitely something that was always very important for us, is to get out in front of as many prosecutors and as many detectives, as many crime scene people as possible to give sort of really intense training on these types of psychologically motivated crimes. So like I said, we had our flagship course was a 3-week training course for detectives on, as I said, psychologically motivated crimes, all the ones that I listed earlier. And, we would do things like you see here, sort of practical crimes in exercises, where they would have to apply their knowledge about what we've taught them about crime scenes of this nature. Can they interpret them? What does this tell us? What should we be worried about? How should we go about this investigation? How do we tell my commander that I think I've got a serial and then we need to bring in extra resources? So that was always a very fun course to present, and typically was really a great bunch of people that we selected to attend that course. So that is only available to police members. We often used to get a lot of civilians asking if they can attend the course, but unfortunately that is a police training course. So what do I do now? What, as I said, what I do now is mainly your threat assessment and threat management, specifically focusing on workplace violence. How do we detect, identify, and intervene in people who are potentially going to behave in a violent way in the workplace, whether that's wanting to do a mass shooting or assaulting their employer or a co-worker, etc. And that's kind of what I focus on now. So it's an extension of what I used to do in the police. But since 2016, this is what I try to do most of the time, COVID pending. And that's really the use of evidence-based guidelines and tools to help us assess the level of concern we have for someone who has come to our attention for some inappropriate behavior. It might be outright threats to hurt someone. It might be an outright violent act that's taken place. Or it might be something that someone has noticed on, social media. Maybe they pick up this guy is posting aggressive things on social media, or he's tagging all these Facebook posts about people in the States who have gone to the workplace and killed people, and then he's tagged it saying, I understand how these people feel. I mean, that would raise concern. What does this guy mean? Is he going to do something in the workplace? And then we would do an evidence-based assessment to see how worried should we be. And then, as I said, most importantly, how do we actually then make sure this doesn't happen? So unlike a lot of the work in the police, where something bad has happened and I can't fix it, I can only help catch the bad guy, but that doesn't really change anything. The threat assessment was very rewarding because it's about picking up concerning stuff as early as possible, assessing it correctly, and preventing something from happening. And that's a very rewarding way of actually operating, as opposed to the retrospective work, which is a lot of police work is. So it is, again, something that I didn't magically know how to do a threat assessment because I'm a psychologist. There's actually research has proven that psychologists are only about 51% accurate in guessing whether someone's a danger or not. So you may as well just flip a coin. But if you have training, that jumps up quite significantly in your ability to assess threats. So I underwent extensive training when I was in the police in threat assessments. So it wasn't my psychologist training that made me an expert. It was my threat assessment training. But of course, being a psychologist was an incredible advantage for me as a threat assessor. And we always say, you can't manage what you haven't assessed. So if you haven't done a proper assessment, there's no way you'll be able to manage whatever that issue is. And there's another saying that we have, if you can't connect the dots if you don't collect the dots. So that's very much about, am I gathering the right information to allow myself to do a proper assessment, to allow myself to do a proper management strategy? So if you put it kind of into a practical scenario, you have someone who reports a concerning behavior, maybe it's a coworker, that should go off to your team of threat assessment people that have been trained, that have the knowledge to look and assess this type of situation. We then gather whatever information from co-workers, family members, girlfriends, husbands, social media that the person might be putting out there. If there's mental health experts that have interacted with this person, can we speak to those people, medical information? And of course, is there any criminal justice history? We gather all this information, and then we actually conduct our threat assessment. And if, for example, we think it's a low assessment, we can step back, just monitor things casually from a distance. But of course, if we think there's a high risk for violence, we then have to go into active management, such as keeping tabs on this person. Can we intervene, for example, if it's a co-worker, can we get this person to see a psychologist? If the person has substance issues, can we get the person into some substance rehab? Or do we need to take more extreme steps, such as opening up a criminal case, getting a protection order, and then again, monitoring the threats throughout? So that's kind of the basic process of what I do now. And as I said, you can do this in various contexts. I chose specifically the workplace environment for doing my kind of threat assessments. And we always say that, threats change. I mean, I'm sure you've even experienced yourself where one day you're incredibly angry to the point where you feel close to punching someone, but, an hour later or the next day, you're not so angry. So threats fluctuate. You're never a yes or no to answer to, is someone a danger? Someone could be low risk today, but next week they are a high risk for whatever reasons, because people change. People's mental health status change. People are drunk one day and they're not drunk the next day, or they start to use substances as their life unravels, or their physical health starts to deteriorate, and that can also be a risk factor. Or your circumstances changed. You may be unhappy about something, but you had a good job and your relationship was stable. But in 6 months' time, because of COVID, you've lost your job, and now you've got financial problems, and because of that, you're having fights with your wife. All those are risk increasers for someone, for example, who had a grudge against another person, or was angry at the city council because they got an electricity bill of 50,000 Rand that they know is wrong. Or COVID, had a great impact on, for example, people's not only their mental health, their physical health, but also their financial status. So circumstances change, people change, therefore people's risk level change, which means we always are continually monitoring risk. Someone's never off the risk radar, as we say. So of course, then as I said, the next phase after you've done your assessment is the management. How are we going to fix this problem, or at least mitigate this problem? And that's when we would have a wide range of people involved. Your threat assessors, if it's in the workplace, you might have your occupational health and safety people, you'd have your security staff, you might have your ethics officers, your human resources officers, if the problematic person is a co-worker, your legal advisors, employee health and wellness, and etc. Those are all the sort of people that we often say are part of the management team of dealing with a concerning behavior. Besides that, what else do I do? I write. So if you don't know, I had published a book last year, March, Profiler Diaries from the Case Files of a Police Psychologist, which kind of talks about my own history of how I got into profiling. It talks about the unit itself and serial murder in South Africa. And then there's about, I think, 5 or 6 cases that I worked on that had a special meaning to me that I discuss in the book. So that's available online, bookstores, etc. And then my second book, called Profiler Diaries 2, From Crime Scene to Courtroom, should be out in August or early September. So if you're interested in sort of local true crime stuff, each chapter is a different story, different case, from serial murder stuff to others. You can go have a look at that. I think it's interesting, but unfortunately, books in South Africa don't earn you a lot of money, so that's more of a hobby as opposed to anything else. It's all, as I said, true cases that I worked on. I also testify in court from time to time. I was in court last week or a week before, testifying in a shooting incident. I'll be in court next Monday and Tuesday in Mabato, testifying about a child molestation case. And so probably about 4 or 5 times a year, I still do some courtroom testimony, typically in criminal matters. Whereas when I was in the police, I was probably testifying twice a month in various types of matters. And I give training to psychologists and others. Now that COVID thankfully is calmed down, although the 5th wave is still out there. For example, this is a training course I'm presenting in June on on psychological murder crime. So I'll be talking for a day about serial murder, serial rape, multi-murder, violent fantasy, etc. I give training on how to be an expert witness as a psychologist or other mental health experts. I do training on domestic violence risk assessment. What's the 4th one? Understanding and identifying paraphilias, which are your unusual sort of sexual disorders. And those I'll present to typically psychologists, but other people do sometimes attend. And what else do I do to keep myself busy? I walk my dog, Zoe. She loves that twice a day. She didn't get a walk today, but I'll do 3 walks tomorrow for her. So that's kind of how I keep myself busy nowadays. And, as I said, a lot of people doing forensic psych work have a normal sort of private practice, and then they will do this as a secondary kind of function. I haven't done therapeutic work since I joined the police. So I probably would have stopped when I left Westcorpies in September 2001. So I would only be saying I just do forensic work. Although, as I said, I'm not allowed to call myself a forensic psychologist because no such category exists. So you can do the forensic work, you just can't call yourself a forensic psychologist. So it's a bit of a kind of a bizarre situation, actually. Let me see, I can't precede my slides. Oh yes, so sorry, I often get these questions and emails, that's why I'm putting this out there. I don't do job shadowing, unfortunately. You'll be very bored because you'll be sitting in my dining room looking at me half the day while I'm on my computer anyway. I don't have work for anybody, unfortunately, I'm sorry. And I can't meet you to discuss your career aspirations. Again, unfortunately, I get lots of requests for that, and it's just not practically possible to be able to do that. So I hope I haven't upset anybody with these three things, but I thought I'd just get it out there. So yeah, so the LNS Threat Management, as I said, is the company that I do the workplace violence threat assessment. You can go check out the website. If that sounded interesting to you, you can find out a little bit more about what that really entails. Then, like I said, in 2019, we started AFTAP, the African Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. We have sort of regular webinars that people can attend on various topics. For example, in 3 weeks' time, we probably have a talk about the spate of child kidnappings by a colonel who's in charge of the hostage negotiators and the police. 3 weeks after that, we will have a talk by the head of the police's counterterrorism investigation unit. He will be speaking about terrorism in South Africa and how it's actually affecting corporates. And then I think the fourth of our series of talks for this sort of series will be about bullying in the workplace. So these are, as I said, webinars that are on our website that people can go look at. So that's www.afatap.africa. I don't know if you can see that. My little thing is blocking it. And at the top is just my email address for my own sort of professional website. If you want to read a little bit more about the stuff I do. I am on Twitter if you want to follow me. I think it's at GN Labuschagne. I think I'm on Twitter. Yeah. I'm not very active, but I post every now and then. All right, I think that was my last slide. So I should stop sharing.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah,
I don't know about the others, but I can listen to you talk all day, especially about your cases. Wow, thank you so much for all that information. You definitely almost convincing me to possibly go into forensic psychology. So thank you for that. And I've also been looking for another book. So I'll definitely have a look. Thank you. Just opening the floor up to any questions that you guys might have. You can either put it in the chat box, you can switch on your mic, and the floor is all yours.
Everybody's shy. I promise I don't bite.
Sorry, I somehow got out of the chat box.
I'm trying to see where it is.
So, Dr. Labuschagne, you mentioned about, and I do apologize, I did refer to you as a forensic psychologist earlier, but as you said, you can't really refer to yourself as a forensic psychologist. So what do you refer to yourself as?
So look, obviously on all my official correspondence, I just say clinical psychologist. So as you'll see, my website is www.forensic-psychologist.co.za. But if you go into the site, I explain, I think I don't refer to myself, I am a forensic psychologist. I think I say I'm a clinical psychologist with a special interest in forensic work. And that's just, purely just to avoid, anybody who wants to lay a complaint against me at the HPCSA. You'll see often on TV, they'll refer to me as a forensic psychologist. I mean, to try and change that, I'm not going to really. But so officially on all the documentation, I would say clinical psychologist. If the media want to refer to me as a forensic psychologist, I'm not going to really jump up and down. Also, it's them, not me, saying it. So yeah, so it is, like I said, it's a bizarre situation where you all I do is forensic work, and that's all I've done for the past 20 or so years, almost literally. But I can't actually refer to myself as such. It doesn't really bug me, to be honest with you. I don't get any kicks out of people calling me I'm a forensic psychologist or not, so it doesn't really bug me.
Awesome, thank you for that. So just maybe more for you, what do you enjoy the most about your field of work?
Well, I think what I do now, as I said, the advising mainly corporates when there's potential danger. I mean, I find that incredibly challenging. It's very kind of, I mean, obviously it's very psychological, trying to understand what do we think this person might do, what do we think is motivating them, and how do we get them to stop is very much sort of a psychological chess, I suppose you could say, but with the very real consequences of, if it goes wrong, someone could get hurt. So it's very challenging and very rewarding. It's like one of the other things I didn't actually mention now that I think of it. I also from time to time do negotiations when there's, for example, extortion cases or kidnapping. And in a way, it's the same kind of thing. It's a sort of real sort of psychological challenge of wits against wits. So I find that prevention, like I said, in terms of the workplace violence, it's very rewarding when you know you've helped avoid anybody getting hurt. And of course, very often how you do that is by helping the person get back on the right path who was the problem. So it's actually rewarding because you've actually helped both sides of the party. I still find testifying in court very rewarding. I really enjoy that. It's a great test of your knowledge. And again, you're there, if you're being honest, of course, you're there to help the court with very difficult things that it has to decide. So I've seen a lot of psychologists do horrifically bad work. Some of it I do think is intentional. They're hired guns. And other times I see a lot of bad work out of ignorance, that people don't understand the forensic context, the courtroom context, and do things that they shouldn't have done, or say things that you in the courtroom scenario you'll get you in trouble. If you did in private practice, it wouldn't get you in trouble because the context is different. So I've always found that it's, you have to be thorough, and it's a very good test of your knowledge to be able to be an expert witness. So I really enjoy that side of it. So I'd say those are the two things, preventing stuff and the courtroom stuff. Like I said, I mean, nowadays, since I've left the police, I very rarely get involved in the investigation side of it. I mean, I absolutely loved working in the police. It was the most fun I had, the most fun for 14 years that I've had in any point in my life, because you just did a lot of fun stuff. You were involved in really interesting cases. You traveled the country. You were there with arrests at times. So it was incredibly exciting, and that was incredibly rewarding. And I probably would have stayed if I hadn't just become frustrated with the organizational side of being in a big organization. And as I got more senior, I got pushed more into the sort of being in your office kind of role and attending meetings for 12 hours. And I just really hated that. I was the kind of person who enjoyed being out there, working with my members on a case was the fun stuff. And I just didn't enjoy the administrative stuff. Otherwise, as I said, I probably would still be there. But of course, working for yourself has its own perks. Your time is yours. As I said, I can walk my dog twice a day. If I want to go to the gym and swim in the middle of the day, I can do that. If I want to write a book, I can do that. If I want to be interviewed on TV, I don't have to get somebody's permission. So, there are benefits on both sides. And as I said, I think I'm enjoying this phase of my life since I've left, to be honest with you. So, sorry, a long-winded answer to your question.
No, please, thank you. I really enjoyed listening to that, and your story is absolute beauty. We have a question from Miss NK Lee. She said, were you recruited by the police? What were the particulars of you starting that line of work?
So the first part, sorry, I missed the first part.
Were you were you recruited by the police?
So,
and the second part
yeah.
is, what were the particulars of you starting that line of work?
So the police, unlike other private businesses, don't recruit. They don't go headhunting. They don't go looking for people. So they would advertise a position that's open, and whoever applies, they would select amongst those people. So, obviously, when the position was advertised about a year after Mickey had resigned, it'd say, you have to be a clinical psychologist, preferably with some experience in the sort of forensic world. And at that point in time, my master's and doctorate had been on interviewing serial murderers. So I was a psychologist and one of the few people that had some kind of related forensic experience. I'd worked at Westkoppies by that time for 3.5 years. I had done forensic assessments for the courts. I'd worked with forensic offenders. So I was kind of in the right place at the right time. I never thought actually I was going to do this kind of work. When I went to study psychology and my master's, I thought I was going to open up work at a hospital, maybe work at a university, private practice. That was kind of what I saw my life to probably be, because I knew there also weren't really opportunities to do this kind of investigative work. And then, as I said, I think the stars aligned, karma was behind me, the position became open, and I was the right person in the right time, and I almost didn't take the job actually, because I wasn't unhappy working at Westcorp. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with intern psychologists. I enjoyed the strange things that we would see at Westcorp. So I didn't leave out of unhappiness at Westcorp. So I almost, when I was finally got the job after the interview process, almost didn't take it because I thought, oof, I don't know. Do you leave something you're okay and happy with for something that you might not be? And I said, well, I'll do it for 2 years and then maybe move on to university. And I think within the first week, I realized where it was that I wanted to be. And as I said, I was there for 14 and a half years. So the requirements now, since I've left, have changed. So as I said, there are still psychologists who are qualified. We'd have to be qualified as a psychologist to get those posts. We do have criminologists working now. So obviously, I think an honors at least, I think, in criminology is a requirement. Then we have, like I said, 1 or 2 researchers. So there, the requirements are a bit broader. Do you have some kind of research background or a degree, etc.? And then, of course, detectives who are in the police who want to work in our environment can join us. So there's various avenues. Some it's from people within the police already, like the detectives, or your professionals like the criminologists, the researchers, and psychologists would be coming from outside. They would do a shortened basic training and, as I said, carry on and be employed. I think that covered both aspects of your question. I hope so. If not, just please remind me.
Thank you so much. Miss MK Lee, if you could maybe just send a thumbs up or something if Dr. Labuschagne answered your question. I have one, very not, anyway. So I'm sure everyone here has, binged The Mentalist. She said, thank you so much. That answer was perfect. So I'm sure, everyone here has watch The Mentalist or like Y50 or all of those other very nice shows. And obviously they're more based in America. But could you possibly tell us if, a lot of what is happening is accurate, the process of investigation, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so obviously, your TV shows like Y50 and which are sort of fictional, they are there to entertain. So they obviously timeline, like DNA is available within an hour. People often do multiple roles, which you wouldn't have in real life. But I think, for things like if you're watching CSI or whatever the equivalent nowadays is, often that technology does exist. It's just, things don't work quite the way they do it in the TV show. We at SAPS, we have all those fancy lights that shine on the crime scene to identify different types of things, whether it's blood, whether it's semen. We have the fancy cameras. We have amazing DNA laboratories, although they're not well managed. We have, as the Plattekloof Forensic Laboratory in Cape Town is probably one of the most modern labs in the world. It was opened up, I think, about 10 years ago. It's phenomenal. It's beautiful. So we do have a lot of those types of forensic tools that you would see on TV. They might not be all over the place, but we do have a lot of those. And like I said, often on the dramatized versions, you find that the crime scene person, like in CSI, it's often as if the CSI people are solving the case, when in reality in South Africa and most of the places I know in real world, your crime scene people just do crime scene stuff. They come, their expertise is to look for, collect, find evidence, collect it and package it, do any basic analysis that they would do, or send it off to the laboratory. They're not going to be really helping you solve the case from an investigative strategy point of view. And again, like I said, that often the profiler in your TV shows almost is the investigator, and that really typically doesn't happen overseas. In South Africa, we were a bit closer to that. So I'd almost say that in terms of our unit, how we operated was actually in a way closer to what you would see on TV of a profiler. But in reality, the other 99% of profilers in the real world weren't that involved in the actual day-to-day running of the investigation. And I think we were a bit different here in South Africa because we had the ability to give a detective an instruction, or if you didn't like this detective because we felt they were incompetent, to get that detective replaced by someone that was. So definitely in the investigative psychology section, we played a far more involved role than I typically saw my colleagues overseas. And in that sense, we operated more like you would perhaps see a profiler on TV, whereas in reality, the majority of profiles weren't doing what we were doing as an in-depth level. So for example, the FBI profilers, they have to be invited into a case. So in the United States, all law enforcement agencies are independent. So you actually have in the US 17,000 completely independent, separate from each other law enforcement agencies. So literally, it's equivalent of the Pretoria Central Police Station being its own police service, their own rules, uniforms, cars, employment, etc. And then the Brooklyn Police Station would be its own police service, for example. So that, so you had a lot of decentralization where here in South Africa, we just have the South African police. So overseas, profilers typically have to be requested by the local police agency to come and assist them with their case. Whereas here, we were part of the SAPS. SAPS is the only law enforcement agency doing investigations that actually allowed us to, even when we weren't asked, we could stick our noses into cases that we heard about and get involved, whether the detective liked it or not, because we were all part of the same organization. So yes, come back to the original question. The fictional stuff is often things happen faster, they blend roles, but often that kind of technology does exist. But again, obviously you get some programs that are way out there and that are not at all related to reality, of course. But again, those things are about entertaining people.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else that has any questions, anything to add? Okay. Mr. Rory, Mr. R.R. Mutang, if I'm saying that correctly, if I may ask out of curiosity, what was your rank in the SAPS?
What is my rank?
Yes.
So I started off as a colonel, because at that point it was a unit, which is a smaller size structure. By the time I left, because we'd expanded and we'd also had sub-units in the provinces, I was then left on the rank of a brigadier.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope that answered your question. Anything else? You guys are more than welcome to either switch on your mic or send a message through. Okay. Well, if there is no one else, Dr. Labuschagne, thank you so much for joining us. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm sure the others did as well. I mean, yeah, we're in the presence of greatness. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
If there are no other questions, you all are more than welcome to leave. Dr. Labuschagne, if I could possibly just ask you to stay behind, please.
Sure, no problem. So one thing I'll just add is that I got often questions about how do you get into doing forensic psychology? So on my forensic psychology website page, I actually put up a whole document about how do you get into the field of forensic psychology in South Africa, for those of you that perhaps had questions like that. So that is there.
Thank you so very much. And you are just being thanked in the chat box at this moment.
Oh, I can't see the chat, so thanks though. I can't. Thanks to everybody.
Yeah, Ms. NK Lee said that was incredibly insightful. Thank you so much, Doctor. Ms. SJ McKinnon, that's a lot of N's and N's. I do apologize. She said thank you for your time, Dr. Labuschagne. Thank you very, very much. You all are more than welcome to leave, and I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.